Maria. Is it better to use a microphone?
Yes.
Okay.
No.
Yes. Yes, we have to because of ADA.
Okay. So thank you for the wonderful introduction. I don't know what I would be making if I was in private industry because I've never tried. Maybe I'll start by saying a few words about myself, and then I'll go into what we're doing here in Arizona, and specifically here in southern Arizona. I grew up in the Tucson area, just north of Tucson, went to CDO High School, and I left when I was 18, got out as quickly as I could. Thought I would never return. Like many of my, frankly, many of my classmates who grew up in the northern suburbs of Tucson, many of us got out and went to college elsewhere and thought for greener pastures. And I found my way back a year and a half ago after the election. I had been thinking of coming back for many years, over the years living in the East Coast, up and down. I lived from Georgia in the south up to Vermont and a few places in between on the East Coast. And before law school, began getting involved in immigrant rights issues. That became more and more my passion, and to a certain extent labor rights issues. And for a time I, after law school, represented farm workers on the East Coast, most of whom were undocumented, but not all, and brought a lot of minimum wage cases and racial discrimination cases in the employment context. And that was kind of my entree into, I think, the work that the ACLU is now doing here in southern Arizona. That's a little bit of my background. Represented more people than I could hope to think of who worked in the fields making $3 to $4 an hour. Not because the law allowed for that. Workers are entitled to minimum wage regardless of immigration status or regardless of place of birth, but because the economic structures allowed for it. I'm not here to talk about labor issues today, but for another day I would love to talk about how labor rights are perhaps our most challenging civil rights issue of our day, because every American, to some extent, relies on themselves or a loved one for their livelihood, with few exceptions, including those who are retired. I hope rely on their past employment for their livelihood today. And so when we talk about civil rights, that was something I learned over the course of several years working on the East Coast, and was brought home to me many, many times. But what brought me back here was that work with immigrant rights and working with immigrant populations in the farm fields. And in 2010, we had the passage of SB 1070 here in Arizona. I was living on the East Coast, far away, far removed, and I had, pangs of wanting to come back, feeling that this was the place where the fight belonged. And life didn't bring me back at that time, but had been thinking about it for many years. Then Trump got elected, and I was living in Massachusetts at the time. And the ACLU at the time did not have a single employee in southern Arizona. They had an employee, and then prior to the election, I don't know if any of you knew my predecessor, Duff Lyle. I know sometimes some of the Green Valley Samaritans have told me that they had remembered him over the years. He had been laid off, so by the time Trump got elected in November of 2016, we had no southern Arizona staff presence because of financial concerns, and we only had staff in the Phoenix office. And long story short, it was, as Miriam encouraged those of you who feel inspired to donate, thank you for considering that, but it really truly does make a difference. We had, in the state of Arizona, 7,000 dues-paying members statewide on the eve of the election. Today we have something like 25,000 dues-paying members. So that quite literally has made the difference in terms of being able to hire a full-time staff person here in southern Arizona. And I'll go into more of what I'm doing specifically here. The Arizona affiliate has a wide range of priority areas, but me specifically in southern Arizona, as Miriam alluded to, I am focused almost entirely on immigrant rights and border patrol issues. And we'll go into that, and I'm sure we'll have a nice, lively discussion about those issues as the hour goes on. I'm always told that in public remarks you should always start with a joke. So I'm already 5 minutes into it, and I haven't given a joke yet. So there was one of Arizona's founding fathers in the 19-teens was a gentleman by the name of Henry Ashurst. Does anyone recognize that name? Henry Ashurst was Arizona's very first U.S. senator. Now, when Arizona was admitted as a state in February of 1912, Arizona, by virtue of becoming a state, was given the right to send 2 senators. Of course, at that time, senators were not elected. They were nominated by, or appointed rather, by the state legislatures. And he was appointed by the state legislature in Arizona, the first state legislature that was impaneled, and he was sent to Washington, and then shortly after the second one was sent to Washington. And he gets up at the dais on the Senate floor, very august body, and he goes, and he was known as, he was not college educated. I'm not even sure that he finished high school, but he was incredibly well read. And he is said to have been able to recite Shakespeare from memory. Needless to say, he was a very loquacious man. And he talked on and on, kind of like I'm doing now. And he goes on the Senate floor and he says, giving his maiden speech, and he says, Arizona is a beautiful state, a baby state, a beautiful baby state, and we're just going to join the pantheon of wonderful states. And he's going on and on about all the virtues of Arizona. And he says, there's only 2 things that Arizona really needs to really become a truly great state in the future. Number 1, we need more people. And number 2, we need some water. Whereupon the senator from New England interrupted. He said, Senator, I'm sorry to interrupt, but those are the same 2 things that hell needs. It's a true story. I say that to say what makes this state great, in my opinion, is all of you in this room, and it is the great people that are fighting the daily fight. I know that there's times when we all feel beat down by the news, by the state legislature, by the local politics, but I've seen, just in the 18 months I've been back, I've seen incredible change, and I'll talk about some of my observations that I think give me hope, and I hope give all of you hope. Let me talk briefly about what we're doing at ACLU of Arizona in general, and then I'll sort of begin to focus in on Southern Arizona, because I imagine that's probably what you want to hear most about. ACLU of Arizona, we have about 20 staff in our Phoenix office. Again, kind of repeating what I said earlier, we had, I think, about 11 or 12 staff in the Phoenix office on the eve of the election. So we've staffed up there as well. And the ACLU of Arizona the ACLU is actually a federated organization similar to other organizations you may be familiar with, like Planned Parenthood or Habitat for Humanity, which has the national apparatus, but it also has local, separate 501c3 local affiliates, what we call them. So that's what ACLU of Arizona is. We're an affiliate of the national. And here in Arizona, we focus primarily on 4 focus areas. LGBT rights, immigrant rights, which I'll talk about in more detail, criminal justice reform, and education equity. So those are the 4 areas. And I always like to say it's actually 4+1, because as you know, the ACLU has always been, since its founding in 1919, has always been a stalwart supporter of the First Amendment and free speech. So I always like to say our priorities are 4+1, because First Amendment will always be one of our priorities, regardless of which way the interests of our board go in. And we have cases in all of those categories. I won't go into detail on every case that we're currently litigating in the state, but I'll highlight a few. And I'm happy to take questions afterward about if any of them pique your interest to learn more. Let's see, in the area of education equity, there's currently something in the order of 530 charter schools statewide. We are not anti-charter school, but we do see that there are challenges with a lack of equity in how the rules and regulations pertaining to public schools versus charter schools, and doing work to try to level that playing field. What's of most concern to us in the charter school realm, and there are many things to be concerned about, but the thing that most concerns us is the way that charter schools choose their students. So we came out with a report late last year titled Schools Choosing Their Students, rather than the other way around. A report that, based on extensive document research of many of these 500 some odd schools and their enrollment practices, and showing that in many cases they have policies that heavily dissuade anyone but the best and the brightest from even attempting to apply to these schools, right? So they can try to focus, concentrate their student body into a certain cohort or certain group, not educating students with disabilities, students of color with disadvantages with enrollment, and of course once students get enrolled, how the disciplinary process, the internal disciplinary process, encourages certain classes of students to leave. So that's one area that we work on. In terms of criminal justice reform, Arizona has one of the highest percentages or proportions of our population incarcerated, and then also the racial disparities. So we have the state of Arizona, 3% of the overall population is African American, 13% of the state prison population is African American, just to give one example. Here in Pima County, it's not just prisons, it's also jails. Here in Pima County, we have the county jail, which is on an average nightly basis, it fluctuates, but on an average nightly basis, about 1,800 people are in that jail awaiting trial. Most of them are not serving a punishment. Most of those people are awaiting their trial on whatever their criminal charges may be. Again, racial disparities persist there as well. And I'll talk more about that if there's interest, but we think we can get that number down from 1,800 down to something more in the 12 to 1,300 range. I'm trying to think. We're currently looking at litigating a number of cases in the realm of criminal justice designed to try to reduce the prison population, try to increase the procedural mechanisms available to criminal defendants. It's been said, actually, Mandela, I believe, said, you don't truly know a country until you've stepped inside its prisons. I've had the pleasure or the displeasure of doing that here in Arizona, in particular the facility located off Wilmot Road. It's a truly chilling experience. I've spent several days there interviewing the approximately 5,000 inmates that are at that facility, and it's a truly chilling experience. But that's a window into some of the work we're doing outside of immigrant rights. And then immigrant rights. I'll devote most of my remarks to that. The Arizona affiliate probably got, well, let me back up. Has anyone been reading the news about Chris Kobach the past few days?
Yes.
You all probably know, for those of you who are following, you all probably know that he finally, the recount resulted in his taking the nomination for governor in Kansas. Why are we in Arizona talking about who's running and who's winning the governorship in Kansas? And the answer is that the man who just got the Republican nomination for governor in Kansas is widely believed to be the architect of SB 1070 in Arizona back in 2010. And there was some really good investigative. I've known about Chris Kobach for years, but I did not know until this week. There was some really good investigative reporting that he, prior to SB 1070, he didn't start with SB 1070. He actually got his start. He was quite small, quite savvy actually. He got his start approaching small towns in red America and going to those towns and saying to their city councils and their mayors and their city managers, you've had an influx of Mexicans recently, and it's killing your small town economy, it's changing the character of your community. Hire me, I'm an expert lawyer on immigration matters. Hire me and I will draft a custom city ordinance for your town. Pay me thousands of dollars. And many of these towns, of course, have small budgets, and they did retain him for that purpose. And then the ACLU, before I arrived, sued them to oblivion. Some of the towns, you know, it's very sad. Some of the towns, as this reporting this past week, I didn't know this part of the story, but some of the towns went bankrupt as a result of the litigation costs. These were towns like Farmers Branch, Texas. Have you ever heard of Farmers Branch, Texas?
Oh,
It's a suburb of Dallas, I think.
Sounds like a band.
Hazleton, Pennsylvania, up along the north of Philadelphia, across the river from New Jersey. So these were relatively small towns, towns that before the latest, Trump era. This is back in the 2004 to 2006 time frame. Towns that he was able to exploit on their fears of immigrant influxes. Anyway, he might be the next governor of Kansas. But the reason I go into that story is because I think it provides a window, or it provides an introduction to the ACLU of Arizona's work on immigrant rights. So he ushered through these city ordinances in places like Farmers Branch and Hazleton in the mid-2000s, and then in 2010 he moved on to Arizona, and it was part of his master plan, because Arizona politically at the time was the state perhaps most ripe to implement some of these policies that up to that point had only been implemented on a city level. And so SB 1070 happened. I was actually, I remember I was in Central America traveling at that time and watching the TV news in Spanish in Central America and seeing my own home state, almost back-to-back coverage from my home state. That was April of 2010. We just passed our 8-year anniversary of SB 1070. The ACLU of Arizona, 3 weeks after the signing of the bill, we filed the first lawsuit before the federal government ended up joining forces as well. The Obama administration filed suit against Arizona, but we got out of the gate first. We filed suit 3 weeks after SB 1070. That lawsuit ended up, as most lawsuits do, taking several years. We ended up nullifying significant portions of SB 1070, but as you probably know, much of it still remains, and there still remains a lot of legal work to be done to continue to nullify additional portions of that law. Yes?
Could you just mention a little bit more about Chris Kobach and what he's been doing recently with the Trump administration?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he has done nothing with the Obama administration.
No.
No. So I think what she's referring to is he was the co-chair, or really the leader of this elections integrity commission that Trump had paneled shortly after he took office, which 8 or 9 months after its creation was disbanded, kind of inexplicably, probably because they couldn't find any evidence of anything and didn't want to acknowledge their failures, so they just sort of quietly made it disappear. So that was Chris Kobach's more recent entree into conservative politics. So that's a little bit of the history of our office and our work on immigrant rights. We fought SB 1070 for many years, had some success, not total success. We also had a separate lawsuit called Melendrez, the Melendrez lawsuit, which was now in its 10th year of litigation against Sheriff Arpaio. And you might ask yourself, well, Sheriff Arpaio's not there anymore, I thought. Why do you still have a lawsuit against Sheriff Arpaio? He's not sheriff anymore, and the answer is, well, it's now called Melendrez v. Penzone, Penzone is the successor to Arpaio. But the lawsuit goes on because we have to keep in mind it's not just about individual people. Individual people can wreak a lot of havoc, and Arpaio is a really great example, but really it's about institutions. And so the example of the Arpaio lawsuit, it's not like he left office and racial profiling in Maricopa County disappeared. It's not like he left office and every immigrant in the county suddenly was free from discriminatory policing practices. So the lawsuit goes on in the form of monitoring, and it's quite an incredible lawsuit because very few times in history do you ever have a defendant on the other side is so unreasonable in terms of, typically you sue someone, and once they realize that their position is no longer defensible, they usually come to the negotiating table. That was not the case in this lawsuit, and so it dragged out for so long, but we got some wonderful case precedent out of that lawsuit precisely because he was so unreasonable. Rarely does a judge have the opportunity, or rarely is a judge presented with the opportunity to articulate that you can't stop someone, a local police cannot stop someone exclusively because they're suspected of being undocumented, for example. It's always been a precept of ours, but rarely have we ever had a case decision specifically saying that much, because as I mentioned, most people we sue usually come to their senses and settle the case before a judge has the opportunity to say that. And then let me bring it down to the local level. So I've talked a little bit about what we do nationally, statewide in terms of immigrant rights. Let me focus in on what we're doing here in southern Arizona. In southern Arizona, the reason I am here in southern Arizona and not in Phoenix, and I'm grateful for that, by the way, is because this is where the Border Patrol is. And so we have a number of lawsuits, and would be happy to talk to you all who live a little bit closer to the Border Patrol than I do, things that you're seeing. Happy to have that conversation during Q&A. But we have a number of lawsuits here. Let me just give you a brief statistical snapshot of the situation as I see it. The Border Patrol, as you may know, is divided up into sectors. There's 20 sectors throughout the United States, 10 of which are along the southern border, 2 of which comprise the Arizona portion of the U.S.-Mexico border. So we are here in the Tucson sector. The Tucson sector runs from the New Mexico border on the east to the Pima County, Yuma County line in the west, so roughly Ajo, town of Ajo. So from New Mexico to the town of Ajo, basically, is the Tucson sector of the Border Patrol. The Tucson sector has about 5,000 sworn agents. Does anyone know how many sworn police officers there are in the Tucson Police Department? There's about 800. 800 sworn officers in the TPD. There's about 500 sworn officers in the Pima County Sheriff's Department, and there's, of course, far fewer sworn officers in Santa Cruz and other places. But just to give you a sense that when I say sworn officers, I mean gun-carrying, badge-wielding employees of Border Patrol. That doesn't even count the administrative staff locally. I give these numbers to give you a snapshot of the degree to which we're inundated with Border Patrol. Some people like to use the term militarization. It's not a bad term. I think it does, the term kind of skirts over the realities of what it actually is that we see here and experience here. But we have 5,000 Border Patrol agents essentially tasked with enforcing a small handful of laws. I mean, really one law, right? I mean, their stated purpose is immigration. Now they kind of get themselves involved in drug interdiction and stuff like that. But let's be generous to them. There's 5,000 Border Patrol agents in the Tucson region tasked with enforcing, let's say, about 10 or so laws. We have 800 TPD officers tasked with enforcing hundreds of state laws, ranging from domestic violence to murder to robbery to burglary to shoplifting to speeding, right? Local police are responsible for essentially keeping us safe. The same cannot be said of the Border Patrol. The Border Patrol's legally, statutorily, I mean, you can talk about rhetoric, but statutorily, they are not here to keep us safe. That's not their legal authorization. Their legal authorization is to enforce immigration laws, not to come investigate if you're a victim of domestic violence, not to investigate if you're the victim of a home invasion. That's not, the Border Patrol's not going to show up to your doorstep to investigate those things. So the disproportion is astounding to me. I'll outline a few of the lawsuits we have directly against the Border Patrol that are still ongoing. How many of you travel out to Aravaca?
Oh, sure.
So does everyone have experience with the Aravaca checkpoint? There, just beyond Amaro. So that checkpoint is the subject of one of our lawsuits currently. There's a group called People Helping People out of Aravaca that a number of years ago decided they were going to be a thorn in the side to the Border Patrol there. And I don't say that in a pejorative way, I say that in a respectful manner, a thorn in the side. And they launched what they call a monitoring campaign, where they say, well, we're gonna have shifts of local volunteers who go out to the checkpoint peacefully. We're not gonna get up in anyone's faces, we're not gonna cause a scene, but we're gonna stand there peacefully and quietly, and we're gonna monitor, take notes, take photographs, take video of every vehicle that passes through that checkpoint, and take notes on the interactions between the motorist and the Border Patrol agent to see if we can see any trends, any trends of abuse, any trends of racial disparities. One of their findings, this was in 2014 when they did the bulk of their monitoring effort. One of their findings, for example, if you're a Hispanic motorist at going through Aravaca, 22 times more likely to be pulled into the secondary lane of inspection than if you're a white motorist. So they did that monitoring campaign for a little while. The Border Patrol, however, on the very first day of the monitoring campaign, pushed them back. So the monitors were never so close that they were up in anyone's face. They were keeping a respectful distance. But the Border Patrol thought that was too close, and so they pushed them back and back and back. I mean, they were standing on the dirt shoulder to the highway. They weren't standing in the middle of traffic or anything. And the Border Patrol pushed them back and back and back to the point now where if you look closely when you pass through that checkpoint or any other checkpoint in the Tucson sector, you now see that there's a kind of a rope, and it says no pedestrian access kind of on the side of the shoulder of any of the checkpoints now, and it's pretty far back. And if you next time you pass through, pay attention to that and envision yourself standing where that rope is and no closer, and whether you could really have much meaningful observation of what's happening. It's pretty far out. They placed the barriers pretty far out. So our lawsuit is an interesting. I mentioned earlier that we always and always will be involved in First Amendment issues. Well, this was one of the unique opportunities. This lawsuit is one of the unique opportunities where we actually have a twofer, where we're challenging the Border Patrol. So in some ways, it's an immigrant rights type of issue. We're also challenging the rights of local Aravacans to monitor the checkpoint, which essentially is a First Amendment issue. So that case, sadly, has been winding its way through the court for the better part of 3 years now. But we had a favorable decision at the Ninth Circuit, which is the Court of Appeals in San Francisco, and they said, we're not quite sure, but we think you're right, ACLU. We think you probably, that Aravacans probably do have the right to get a little bit closer. So we're still fighting the end of that case. We have a case against the hieleras. Does anyone know what that is? Hielera is the Spanish word for icebox. And that's the term that migrants have used to describe the short-term holding facilities of the Border Patrol. There are 7 or 8 of them in the Tucson sector. So they're holding facilities intended for short term, so like 1 to 2 to 3 days. But increasingly we're finding that people are staying there longer and longer. They're supposed to be transferred to longer term facilities up in Eloy or Florence, or in some cases, if they're from Mexico, they can deport them quickly. They're supposed to be deported rather quickly, but they end up spending days and days and days in these facilities that are designed to be short term. And when I say short term, what do I mean? No beds, no shower facilities.
Wow.
Right, so spending 3, 4, 5, 6 days now in these facilities with no beds and such. So in the third or fourth year now of that lawsuit, and pushing them to provide beds, provide mattresses, provide sheets, provide better food, shower facilities, etc. We have a number of what we call FOIA lawsuits. FOIA is the Freedom of Information Act, where we're suing the Border Patrol to get information about how they operate. As you may know, it's an agency cloaked in a great deal of secrecy. And we've obtained now thousands of documents relating to checkpoints, relating to roving patrols. Has anyone ever been stopped by a Border Patrol agent in a traffic stop
Yes.
setting?
Yes.
That's what the Border Patrol refers to as a roving patrol. So that when they stop you just driving down the road. Keep in mind, as I mentioned, that they cannot enforce traffic laws. They can't pull you over for speeding or for minor traffic infractions. So it always baffles me how they have the right to pull most people over in a traditional traffic setting. But anyway, we got some documents related to that. In one of those documents, for example, many documents revealed the incredible overreach, constitutional overreach of local Border Patrol. One of the documents I will not soon forget. It was a complaint actually filed by one of the agents. He filed it with Internal Affairs, and he said, our station chief, my boss, is coming to us during our morning group meetings and telling us that we have to stop every single vehicle on a certain stretch of road near Naco. And it was the agent who filed the complaint quoted his boss as saying, "I don't care if the damn President of the United States is driving down this section of the highway, I want you to stop him. Every single vehicle. Every single vehicle. I don't care if you have reasonable suspicion or probable cause. There's no basis to stop him. You stop him anyway. You find a reason."
Wow.
That was just one example that sticks out in my mind. So that's an example of what the power of FOIA to shine light on the inner workings of government. And then I'll wrap up my remarks by talking about local government and local government's role in either pushing back against the Trump agenda or their role in being complicit. And I'll give you a few examples of what we've accomplished in the past 6 months here in Southern Arizona. And I should say that a lot of what I'm about to talk about, or a lot of what I have talked about, are policies that existed under Obama and existed under Bush, and they've existed for a long time, especially with regard to the border. The border enforcement has done nothing but increase under every president since Reagan. So it's not so much a partisan or political issue. Well, it's a political issue. It's not so much a partisan issue. But we are in the Trump era, so I'll refer to the Trump era. As I mentioned earlier, we have 800 local TPD officers. We have 500 sheriff's deputies here in Pima County, and the Border Patrol relies on them. ICE relies on them to be partners. They call them, the Border Patrol, or in law enforcement parlance, they call them force multipliers, which is a euphemistic way of saying we have 5,000 of our own agents, we got a few hundred extra in our pocket. That's what they mean when they say force multipliers. Now, there are some instances of cooperation and collaboration between local police and Border Patrol that many people would not find objectionable, even lefties like like us in this room. But for example, investigations of human trafficking, large-scale cartel investigations, things of that nature. But the bulk of the cooperation and collaboration is not that, I'll tell you. The bulk of the collaboration and cooperation is snagging otherwise law-abiding immigrants, some of whom may be undocumented, but otherwise law-abiding, who are our neighbors, who are our community members here in Southern Arizona who call Tucson area their home. Pima County is 1 million people, 100,000 of them residents, not people passing through, not border crossers, passing through to another destination, but 100,000 of the million residents of Pima County are foreign-born. It's hard to tell how many of those are undocumented, but all that's to say that we have lots of neighbors and lots of community members who call Tucson their home, but may not have the benefit of federal immigration status. And the number one way that that population gets ensnared in the deportation machine is not by ICE raids at their workplace, is not by ICE knocking at their door. It is by otherwise innocuous interactions with local law enforcement, getting pulled over for speeding, things of that nature. And now keep in mind, the reason I mentioned earlier, well, it's important to keep in mind that Border Patrol cannot, they don't have the legal authorization to pull you over for speeding. And they want that ability. They badly want to be able to do that. But the law being what it is, they can't. So what do? Well, they just create partnerships with those who can. And that's why when we talk about local policy changes, that's an important, I think an important thing. A few years ago, TPD did change its policies, and they have implemented written policies pertaining to when they're allowed to call ICE and Border Patrol and when they're not allowed to, and they've gotten their numbers way down. So the numbers used to be several dozen per month, meaning several dozen times a month when TPD pulled somebody over for a routine traffic type of thing. Border Patrol and ICE ended up getting involved before that traffic stop was over. That number is now down to 3, 4, 5 a month. Up until 6 months ago, the Sheriff's Department had no policy, zero. So there was nothing guiding its officers, its deputies, on how to interact with Border Patrol and ICE. The Sheriff's Department has a 400-page manual for its deputies that I think deputies are supposed to read. I did read it, and it consists of, for example, 3 pages of the 400 pages are devoted exclusively to bicycle patrol, the Sheriff's bicycle patrol. If you're a bicycle cop, a bicycle deputy in the Pima County Sheriff's Department, you have 3 pages guiding you on every detail on how to maintain your bicycle, what to do with your bicycle patrol, what not to do with your bicycle patrol. And up until 6 months ago, there was not a single word, not a single sentence describing what deputies were to do when they encountered one of the 100,000 local residents who might be foreign-born. Pretty astounding. Keep in mind, lest I be accused of being partisan, what party were the previous 2 sheriffs? Sheriff Dupnick and Sheriff Nanos were both of the Democratic Party. It has now come to Sheriff Napier, a Republican, who is now, in collaboration with us, has developed the department's first immigration-related policies and racial profiling policies. There was also no racial profiling policy because his predecessors used to say, we don't need a racial profiling policy. You know what our policy is on racial profiling? We don't do it. So you don't need to put it in writing. Again, institutions. It's not about people, it's about governing institutions. If men were angels, no laws would be needed, right? Was that Madison? So that's some of the progress we've made here in Southern Arizona in the past 6 months in terms of immigration policy, trying to shut down the collaboration between local law enforcement and the federal folks. I like to think that it's like the old quote, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, render unto God that which is God's. Well, here it's render unto the feds what is theirs, and unto the locals which is theirs. Let's you know, I'm under no illusions that we're going to abolish the Border Patrol anytime soon, despite some of the hashtags to that effect. But in the meantime, we can keep each relatively separate to the extent that it's appropriate. I'll conclude my remarks there, because I've taken up a lot of time yammering.
Yes. I have a question. that's been sitting in my head since you talked about the people down in Arivaca who went out to look and see what was happening at the checkpoint there, and then got moved back. Did they, or do they, use electronic devices to visualize from a distance? I mean, I know long lenses on a camera can visualize that distance without any trouble, or to record, and if they have tried to do that, have they run into trouble with the Border Patrol for trying to do that?
I don't know what their technological capabilities are, but I will say this. Part of why they want to get close is not merely to see, but also to hear.
Yeah, I assumed that was true, but I thought at least they could visualize, and I didn't know if they had tried to do that.
Yeah, it's possible they have.
Yeah.
Yes?
Can you tell us at the current time your positions on the separation of parents and children?
Yeah, I didn't mention that. What's bad? What our position is, or what we're doing about it?
What are you doing about it?
So, we have a lawsuit called the Miss L lawsuit. The Miss L lawsuit is primarily being driven by the ACLU National Office out of New York City, and that was a lawsuit filed in San Diego, but it has gained nationwide prominence and it has gained nationwide legal status as a class action. And so that's the case that you may have been reading the headlines about over the past 6 weeks, where the judge, Judge Dana Sabra, who was appointed by George W. Bush, has handed the Trump administration order after order. I mean, he's slapped them down so many times now through that lawsuit in the past 6 to 8 weeks. That's the same lawsuit that you may have seen a headline last week or 2 weeks ago that the Trump administration suggested that the ACLU be the ones to pay for locating the parents. That was the same lawsuit that set the deadline, the two-tiered deadline, which was the Judge Sabra gave them 15 days to reunite the youngest children, and then an additional 15 days to reunite the older children. So all those headlines that you were reading about, that was the Miss L lawsuit.
Can you speak a little bit with respect to the Stone Garden? Sorry. My understanding is that it's sort of wending its way around, and there's been a forensic accounting of some sort with respect to how they've used their money. And my understanding is that the ACLU said they had no problems with the accounting part. But it's nonetheless being stalled. I'm not exactly sure.
So Stone Garden is a federal program that's tied in with the conversation about Sheriff Napier. Stone Garden is a federal program existing since 2004 that gives an annual allotment from the feds to local police jurisdictions lying close to the border. So that in Arizona, that's the 4 border counties, plus I think Pinal County gets some of the money. And in Pima County, it's $1.4 million, or it was supposed to be $1.4 million this year. What we did, myself and a number of other ally groups, we pressured the Board of Supervisors, and I know that Steve Christie represents you all here. I can talk about that for a whole nother hour, but we had 3 of the 5 Board of Supervisors, not Steve Christie, to support placing conditions on Stone Garden. So the written policy I mentioned to you about racial profiling and interactions between sheriff and federal agencies, that policy was essentially coerced, for lack of a better term, conditioned on Stone Garden. So basically we, or the supervisors more properly, told the sheriff, you get your money, but you better put in place this written policy first. And the written policy does not apply only to Stone Garden operations, it applies to all your operations for all 500 of your deputies at all times. But Stone Garden is basically a program where they go out to the more outlying areas of the county, Arivaca, Ajo, etc., and they do what's called traffic saturation. So they basically are there for like an 8-hour work shift, compensated for by the federal Stone Garden program, and their objective during those 8 hours is just to stop as many people as they can for low-level traffic things like tinted windows, or having dice hanging from your rearview mirror, or speeding 5 miles over, things that deputies would never pull someone over for under normal circumstances because they're so minor that it wouldn't warrant wasting a deputy's time stopping someone for 5 over the limit. So, but they do that under Stone Garden because they want to have as many contacts, they call them, as many contacts with members of the public because they want to find undocumented folks and drugs for Border Patrol. And so Border Patrol controls that money, and they have to report to Border Patrol. So the deputies have to, each shift, they have to radio in, not to their own internal supervisor, but to a Border Patrol agent to say, oh, I'm clocked in now, I'm performing your job now. So that's one of many examples of that collaboration. It does not look like we're going to end Stone Garden this year, but keep in mind that it comes up every year before the Board of Supervisors, and we've built quite a bit of political power, I think, in the past 6 months to be able to come back again and raise questions continually again.
Yeah, I wanted to mention, I went to hear Grijalva speak last night, and Richard Elias is one of the chairs of the Nucleus Club where Grijalva was speaking. And Richard talked to us, and then I talked with him separately afterwards. He's one of the county supervisors that you're talking about. He's really very opposed to Stone Garden. There's something coming up at the September meeting, and it may have been the ICE office in the jail. They're really trying to get it out. There may be other things as well, but what he said to me is if you can get as many people as possible to come to the next county supervisors meeting, which I believe, are they Tuesday nights?
Tuesday mornings,
Tuesday morning.
Unfortunately for those who work normal office hours, but yeah, 9 a.m. on Tuesday, September 4th is the next meeting. And that issue, yes, it all is, you're correct, it's all tied up together. So the Stone Garden issue and the ICE in the jail. Sheriff Napier, just a real quick history, Sheriffs Dupnik and Nanos did not have ICE physically in the jail. Now they were bad on other things, but they did not have ICE physically in the jail. And Napier, in one of his first months in office, invited ICE employees to basically take up residence inside the jail if they so desired, and of course they did so desire. And that allows ICE agents, when a person is booked in, you heard me say earlier that there's 1,800 people on average per night, so when they're booked in, they go into this kind of entry room, this kind of preliminary room, and an ICE agent is allowed to be there if they want to and question anyone they want to about their immigration status. So they can help. So it helps ICE to identify which of the 1,800 people that night, for example, might be deportable. So Richard has been a real stalwart advocate to kick ICE out of the jail, and September 4th might be the board meeting in which that kind of issue is resolved. Now Napier has indicated that he's indicated that he's possibly amenable to this issue. Now when I met with him privately 6 months ago, he said absolutely not. Absolutely, I will not take them out of the jail. So you can see how the political ground has shifted in our favor over the past 6 months. I mean, Richard was always behind us, but Napier was not even willing to entertain the possibility. But the fact, I think that goes to a lot of the work that many of you in this room are doing, and many folks in Tucson, people showing up to the board meetings. Richard and Supervisor Bronson have commented to me. They said, I've never before seen consistently meeting after meeting, every Tuesday morning that we have meetings, 10, 15 people standing up to speak during call to the audience on this issue, or on any issue, right? I mean, we always have 2 or 3 people on this or that issue, but we've never had 10, 15 people every meeting consistently hammering the issue of that collaboration between the two, between feds and locals. Yes?
I was at the last meeting, and I noticed that Steve Christie was clear in saying that he supports the sheriff and he supports the Border Patrol, and he is adamant that his support will always be there. He has stated publicly that his constituents, us, want the Border Patrol in, or want ICE in the county jail. He has not even recommended someone to be on the committee that's for is forming the regulations about what the sheriff should do for our district. So we have no representation from him on this issue. And I would encourage you all to keep his phone number written on your arm until September 4th and call it every day. And you taught me to write a number on my arm.
That's great. And I'll just add on to that. One of the conditions that we talked about when they conditionally approved Stone Garden funding, one of those several conditions that I did not mention but you alluded to was the creation of this Citizen Oversight Commission, which is it's supposed to be a 10-member body that meets one day a month. It's by the way, it's open to the public. Even if you're not one of the 10 members, you can still attend. And they're digging deep into a lot of the data related to racial profiling and immigration. It's really wonderful to see. But you're right that Steve Christie has not appointed his two. I do want to clarify that he has appointed one of his two. So there is one of the two vacancies has now been filled. One of his two vacancies has now been filled, but there is still one vacancy. So if any of you in this room live in his district and want to contact his office and volunteer, say, Mr. Christie, I would love to serve. I would be honored to serve under your nomination on this commission because there's only 7 of the 10 slots are currently filled. So, yes.
I have 2 comments. One is my friend who's on the very far right, you might hear strange things from, tells me that the reason there are so many stops at the Arivaca station is because all the people that live down there are old hippies and they smoke pot. And so they set off an alarm every time they go through. So
I am friends with many. There's only 700 residents of Arivaca, and I know quite a few of them. I don't think they all meet that description, but that may be true. They do have canine dogs at the Arivaca checkpoint, so it's possible that they're detecting stuff. But that gets to a broader issue. The checkpoints. There was a report that came out from the Government Accountability Office a few months ago that found that 40% of drug seizures at checkpoints, not just that checkpoint, but writ large, 40% of drug seizures at checkpoints are of 1 ounce or less of marijuana in the possession of a U.S. citizen, which is basically a way of saying they caught a joint. Congratulations. Congratulations, Border Patrol. You operate a several $million-a year checkpoint system, and you're catching a large number of joints. Congratulations.
And one more
I want to know what
comment.
happened to
My
that.
sister was in Nepal one time and she said that she noticed at the border that the guards were like fingertip apart. They had that many guards along the border. Well, I did a calculation one time that with the 5,000 Border Patrol people that we have here, we could put them almost that close together along our border.
I haven't done the math, but that might be true.
That'd be a wall.
Yes, I think we only have time for one more question. So.
Oh, well, this is just, where is that meeting on September 4th?
Oh, good question. It's downtown Tucson. It's 130 West Congress, right downtown in the county government complex. If you know where the Tucson City Hall
Is
is.
that where Barbara Lawal's office is? That's on Stone. I
No,
guess.
that's a different building.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, one more.
I was just gonna say, I'll post it to our Facebook page if you want to get times, dates, addresses, directions. You can find it all on the A4A.
And maybe I'll write I didn't bring my business cards. Maybe I'll write my email address if you have questions. Everyone who you don't have to speak, but you are given up to 3 minutes. Each person is given up to 3 minutes to speak. And if you want to email me offline here, and I can explain to you how that works if you haven't done it before.
And it would be good to say you're from Green Valley in Steve Christie's district.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's important.
That's good.
I have one question, the answer might take longer than the question. The rule that the judge made about returning the children to their parents, which has obviously been violated, and he said you've got X amount of time, they keep ignoring that. I mean, the first response was, oh, the ACLU can do it. Aren't we at the next 15-day period? We're darn close.
I'll be honest, I haven't followed the latest in that particular lawsuit because it's taken so many twists and turns procedurally, but it brings a broader question, which I won't have time to get into, but it brings a broader question about the power of the judiciary generally to have oversight over the executive branch. But I will, yeah, there's a few wonderful examples in history of this, but if you'd like to, if you have lots of time in your hand, you really want to dig deep into that power dynamic between the judiciary and the executive branch, I highly recommend a book. I forget the title of it, but I'll contact me after. It's by Stephen Breyer, one of the justices in the Supreme Court. He wrote a wonderful book, and there's a wonderful chapter in that book about giving historical examples of where the executive refused an order of the Supreme Court or refused judiciary orders. And his conclusion, in short, is this. One of the reasons why we still have a great country, despite all the other nonsense, this is a great way to end, is because there's very, very, very few examples in our history where the executive has, at the end of the day, has outright refused an order of the court. And there's not a lot of countries in the world you can say that about.
That's true.